Greg Schott. He used to be, he's done a lot of things, but I first met him when he was VP of marketing at SpringSource, and then he became CEO of Mulesoft. Mark Brewer was VP of lots of things at Covalent, and then SpringSource, and then VMware, and now he is CEO of TypeSafe, the company behind the Scala language and the Akka and Play frameworks for Scala and Java. And this is Marten Mickos, who was CEO of MySQL, which sold eventually to Sun Microsystems for about $1 billion. Exactly $1 billion? And now he's CEO of Eucalyptus, a company that makes cloud software that lets you run on-premise clouds that are compatible with Amazon Web Services. So Nate, if you could put up that slide number 4 for what I'm going to ask these guys. And you know all this already. These are the talking points I send you. All right.
Have we seen this?
What's that? Yeah.
Have we seen it?
Yeah, you've seen it. Thank you. You haven't seen it with the pictures and the logos. So what I'd like to learn from 3 of these gentlemen is part 1, their personal story, how they got involved in these open source projects, why they created or joined these companies, what are the best and worst parts of being involved in them, what was it like to raise money, dealing with VCs, what are the things unique about open source, were they the professional CEO? In all 3 of their cases, they were the professional CEO that was brought in to run the company. And then part 2 is the project itself. What is it? What does it do? What do you sell? What was the traction when you started? Who do you sell to? Why do people buy? All that kind of stuff. So if we could all spend 5 minutes, so each of you with a 5-minute monologue just to talk about maybe the first part, or if you prefer to go into the second part first, that's fine too. And just talk for 5 minutes without interruptions. I'll sit quietly over here, and we'll do sort of one round of 5 minutes, another round of 5 minutes, and I might have a couple of questions in between the 2 things, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So Greg, why don't you take us in?
Okay, so 5 minutes to kind of get through.
One or the other, or any combination.
One or the other. Okay. And 30 seconds to talk about 111 Minute. We had our holiday party here a couple years ago, and they sent me over the week before the holiday party to check out the space, and they have rotating art exhibits here, and it was all covered with kind of pornography. Or it was art, but it was special kind of art. And I called my assistant and said, "Oh my God!" They said, "Don't worry, it's changing next week." So anyway, and then it changed to vampire art, which was still a little disturbing for the holiday party, but it was okay.
We tried to get that exhibit back in.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just cover some of these points. I'd been in software. Started with SpringSource, kind of my first open source opportunity. Knew that a little bit from the middleware space. Saw one of our head of sales had moved over to Mule. The company was, at the time, it was the beginning of 2009. Things were tough all over. Mule had an interesting opportunity, kind of the beginnings of a good company, had some good growth. Good board, and that's what kind of drew me in. I saw there was this integration space, biggest unsolved IT problem ever, and it was an opportunity to potentially go do something interesting around that. We had some good traction, good open source project around it. Best part is it's just fun to be working on a business model that is so transformative and so different than everything that had come before open source. I don't think open source is particularly new at this point anymore, but it's still, the models are just so different than what the legacy vendors are using, and it's just fun to have that kind of edge. And the worst part of it's kind of the other side of that, which is trying to figure out how to kind of manage a commercial model where you're giving away software for free, and sometimes you're competing against yourself in the marketplace. And frankly, I found, for us at least, the hardest part sometimes is you feel like you're running really kind of 2 companies. You're having to do marketing and product and everything around open source to drive the adoption there, and then you're telling your marketing team, okay, schizophrenically kind of move over and now market to the commercial side of the house and have websites that cater to both, and kind of have one foot in the commercial world and one foot in the adoption world, and that's challenging. You have to be successful at both to be a successful open source company. Yeah, raising money, dealing with VCs, that's a whole separate discussion. Let's see. Traction for us was, at the time, we were open source enterprise service bus, service-oriented architecture technology. SOA had kind of fallen out of favor at the time, and downloads were pretty flat, and we were trying to figure out how to get it to climb again. A couple things created, well, we did a good job ourselves from a marketing standpoint, from a product standpoint, but also all the SaaS adoption, and while SOA hasn't become cool again and probably never will, integration is an age-old problem that will never go away, and the services that used to be services that people thought about, kind of web services, on-prem type things have all moved over, and now it's APIs. So public APIs are nothing more, now arguably the web in general is nothing more than service orientation. So the need for what we do as a core backbone to connect things together has never gone away, and we're feeling kind of the wind at our backs now from a download standpoint, a user standpoint, just because of all the SaaS that's being used. Everybody is kind of, talk about BYOD, there's BYO SaaS now, where you've got companies that have tens or hundreds of apps that people have drug in and swiped credit cards for, and at some point they run back to the IT department and say, okay, you started using this stuff and my whole department loves it, it's great, but we didn't think we were going to have to connect it to anything. Now we have to connect it back to SAP or to Salesforce or out to the web onto something like a Twitter or Facebook. We need to make those connections happen, and so they pull us in one way or another. We either get pulled in through the IT world or we get pulled in through line of business, and that's kind of what's creating the wind at our sails at this point. Sales model is started out as something that was very much of a on the phone, high transaction sales model. We still do that, but it has started to morph fairly dramatically to larger 6- and 7-figure enterprise deals, and that means we have a sales force that's more oriented toward solution-based selling and sales engineers. And we're trying to keep it from being kind of 8-legged IBM type sales calls, but it is certainly starting to get much more enterprise focused in our selling methodology. Right?
There are a number of questions I can think of based on what you said, but we'll come back to those. One thing I forgot to mention was Greg's company just, and this is public and it was announced, so I can mention it, they just raised a big round at an $800 million valuation. So that was in the last month or so. So congrats to him on that. Mark is CEO of TypeSafe, and it's got the interesting challenge that it originally started off trying to monetize a language called Scala. And then recently, in the last year and a half or so, they've realized that there are other ways to monetize around Scala. So I'd like him to talk about that. But also, don't forget the personal story of Covalent and SpringSource and VMware, and now being brought in to run TypeSafe.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I'm amongst other old timers in the open source world here, but it's hard to imagine. It's been almost 15 years. Yeah, it's going on 15 years that I've been involved in open source companies. The first one was Covalent. Covalent was known for bringing Apache-based software to the enterprise under commercial terms or commercial licenses. So in 2000, when I joined Covalent, we basically had an open core model of taking the Apache web server and some modules around it, packaging it up and selling it as an enterprise commercially licensed distribution. And I'll pick on open source business models as I go through kind of my story here. But one of the challenges with that was that people were already adopting Apache. They were using it as fast as people launched or set up new servers, they were putting Apache on it, as opposed to, back then it was Netscape and Internet Explorer, and really Apache was killing all of them. But the challenge with the business model was that we were asking people to switch out their Apache servers and put in our commercial distribution, the one that we sold as a commercially licensed product, even though it was all based on Apache, and in fact was probably the exact same version that they were already using. You can imagine what the ops guys said when we said you have to uninstall that shit and install this one. It didn't go over very well. And so what I learned in that lesson is, number one, VCs don't always know how to define a good business model, because we were basically following their lead. Nobody else had really defined one yet other than Red Hat, and MySQL was really just getting started too. So what happened was the company went through a couple of funding rounds. We built a product that later became Hyperic, which was a management and monitoring tool, initially targeted at monitoring and managing open source based stuff, right? Linux on up. And when the company couldn't get funded in 2003, the VCs wanted to shut it down. And I had already pitched them a couple of times on spinning out the Apache business, but I wanted to run it as an open source services model, right, as opposed to an open core model. And they weren't too hot on that idea, but when the company couldn't get funded, they agreed to sell it to me. So myself and one of the other founders bought Covalent. We spun out Hyperic, or what became Hyperic. That was a separate group. And then we ran the business in a very simple manner. We said anybody that has Apache web servers running and they want support on them, support where they can ask questions, where they get SLAs on fixes or security vulnerabilities, we would cover it, as long as it was a version that we felt comfortable we could support. And by the way, we still had our commercial distribution, but we made that available to them under the term of the support or subscription at their choosing. So in other words, if they didn't want to use it, they didn't have to. The goal was, of course, to get them to use it so that we got our lock-in on that commercial distribution. Anyway, fast forward, that worked for 4 years. I built a business around Apache Web Server and Apache Tomcat, to where we were doing about $5 million in revenue. We sold to a company that Greg was at. It was called SpringSource, and that tied the development framework, Spring, to a runtime, Tomcat, and enabled developers to basically have a preferred platform to build their Spring or run their Spring applications on. And that business model, of course, was a combination of services around the framework, so training and consulting, commercial license and support around the runtime, Tomcat, and all the pieces around Tomcat. And of course, that company, it grew very fast, both because of that acquisition, but also because the framework was just so widely popular. And I'm sure Rod would say something different, but I like to think Spring really did one thing well. It enabled Java developers to get their job done, right? Java developers were struggling with, whether it was EJBs or whatever, it didn't matter what they were using, they were struggling with it and trying to build apps. Spring made it possible for them to get those apps out. And with Tomcat as the container, it made it easy to deploy, it made it easy to run those applications. And of course, it made it so our company could make some money. And just a side note, that business from 4 million, by the time myself and a few others left VMware, it was about 178 million in annual revenue. And that's a subscription-based business. That's where somebody's paying for a license to use it for a term, right? Okay, so VMware acquired us in 2009. What happened? Went to a big company again, and this was the second time in my career, and enjoyed it for a little while, but the lessons learned there were really, I didn't fit in in a large company. I belonged in a small startup, and I was out looking at technologies for VMware as part of my role in running operations that we might bring into Cloud Foundry, bring into the kind of middleware group inside of VMware. And I found this little project called Scala, which is of course a language, and I found Akka, which is think of it as a containerless runtime for running your Java or your Scala applications. And most importantly, it allows you to scale in the cloud elastically, up and down, based on need, not based on servers available. So anyway, we didn't acquire them, obviously, but I left VMware, and they were looking for a CEO, so I joined in 2012, and I see I'm running out of time. So before I'll wrap that up, and I want to make a comment on what I've learned over my career in open source. There's really 3 things that have worked for me. Number one, when you're building an open source business, choose a license that is the right license for the target, for the people who are using it, not for your business model. Because if you don't choose it for who you're trying to get to use your software, instead you choose it so how you can monetize, you're probably going to restrict or limit how big you can grow. Number 2, and probably most important, is foster, develop, invest in your community like it's the difference between success and failure, because it is. If you don't grow your community, if your community isn't thriving, that whatever your product is, you're going to suffer. And the last one is monetize how and when your constituent you're selling to, when it's appropriate for them. So make sure you don't force yourself into a monetization strategy just because you need to monetize. there's other ways you can make money around open source software, right? You can make money on services. That's what TypeSafe did, SpringSource did as well. So training and consulting didn't figure out how to make money on a product until after we had a large audience or a large number of users, and also had a really clear idea who we were targeting. So, stop the clock.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So before I ask Martin this question, I just want to let the audience know that we like to not surprise our guests, and that Martin's had fair warning that I'm going to ask this question. And the question is, when you showed up at MySQL to run the company versus when you showed up to run Eucalyptus, what went right at MySQL and what went wrong at Eucalyptus?
Yeah, it's the same guy. And I should be smarter now. Well, first of all, I love problems that are really difficult and nearly impossible. And we had such a challenge at MySQL. We built it into a fantastic business. We pioneered the open source business models. We show that you can combine community and business in one, although it hurts, but it can be done. What MySQL had done absolutely right before I joined and kept doing was, there was an amazing focus on the customer. So it's all started in the Python language, where there was the MySQL database included in the language back then, and then they added MySQL, which emulated the exact same API as MySQL and just was a little bit more stable. So people said, okay, if there are two databases and one is more stable, I use the one that's more stable. And then the next step was in the PHP world, when Rasmus Leerdorf said, it's such a mess with databases. When you try to browse through data on a website, you can't go 20 rows at a time because relational databases don't support it. And overnight, the MySQL founder wrote the code for the limit clause, which violates the SQL standard, but made browsing on a website easy. And now all relational databases have it, but back then it was a violation of the standard. So MySQL had this extreme focus on customers, was ready to violate any principles that were out there, and also always did things in a simple way. And people came to me and said, Martin, MySQL is just a glorified file system. And I smiled back and said, so? Meaning, the fact that we didn't do store procedures and triggers, the fact that we didn't do all of that stuff that you have in relational databases, that was actually our strength. And we had to have the strength to not develop them. Once we developed them many years later, it complicated our product and made everything go slower. So we might even have made a mistake there then. So at MySQL, this extreme focus on users and simplicity and being ready to violate accepted practices was the thing that drove it to success. When I came to Eucalyptus, I was presented with a similar story. Here's the most popular cloud platform, runs wonderfully well, go in and build a $1 billion business here. Well, turned out the product was a prototype at the time. There hadn't been an intense focus on users. There had been an intense focus on the concept of cloud platforms, an intense focus on Amazon compatibility, an intense focus on many very valuable things, but not on the customers. So when we brought the product out to users and customers, they hurt themselves on it. Eucalyptus was a very temperamental product. You had to love it really deeply to really make it work well. And then it worked well. But you had to have this endless empathy and passion for the product in order to make it work. Like some people today would argue that you need for OpenStack to make it work. So anyhow, so there were some similarities between MySQL and Eucalyptus, and still are very strong similarities, but also a completely different original approach where MySQL came in and said, what's the simplest way of pleasing and delighting users? And Eucalyptus came to it and said, what's the most all-encompassing way of solving this private cloud research question that we had? So we've been fixing that. Now we have an amazing product in Eucalyptus. It just works. People love it. It's not complicated, it's not messy. You don't have to install 7 different projects to get it to work. We've really worked hard, but that has taken time.
Well, actually, why don't you use your last minute
My last minute!
to talk
My
about
last minute on what?
OpenStack
On my life?
versus Amazon Web Services.
Sorry, about...
OpenStack versus Amazon Web Services, and what is going to be the de facto
Right.